of cloth has increased, which means the demand for cloth will go down and the demand for wine will go up. So the relative demand for cloth falls, and the world relative demand curve for cloth shifts to the left. So we have an increase in the relative supply and a decrease in the relative demand. So lo and behold, as you might expect, we get just the opposite result. The external relative price of cloth falls. Okay. So what we see then is when we provide an export subsidy, the firm that produces that good can now charge a higher price domestically as well, because we're going to end up with prices being the same in both the internal and the external market. So a higher price for domestic manufacturers means that they're going to want to increase their output. So we get it in, if we increase the output of one good, we have to reduce the output of the other along the production possibilities frontier. So we get an increase in the relative supply of cloth. Consumers, of course, are faced with higher prices for cloth, so they're going to buy less of it. So we also have a reduction in the relative demand, dropping the relative price of cloth. So in the external market, the world market, the relative price falls, and that implies then for Portugal the terms of trade decline. And the relative price of wine rose, which implies that the terms of trade for England increased. So notice in some sense we get just the opposite effects. Impose a tariff on imports, we see that the relative price of our relative price will actually rise. We actually have an increase in our terms of trade, and the international trade effects are positive. If we impose an export subsidy, now we end up lowering the external price, and that reduces our terms of trade, so that the international trade effects actually reduce our aggregate economic welfare. Somehow that seems a little odd, right? I mean, with export subsidies, we're promoting the industry in which we already have a comparative advantage. We know that because that's our export good. But by promoting it, we actually end up in the external market by increasing the supply and driving down the price.
Will the price fall by 20%?
No, the internal price of cloth will go up by 20% relative to the initial external price. So if we look at internal prices, we had a 20% higher relative price of cloth from here. Right? Now, once the external price falls, our export subsidy is still 20%, but it's 20% based on the external price. So now it's 20% above this, not that. Yes?
Wait, why would Portugal do this now?
Why does the U.S. government subsidize Boeing exports? Why does the European Union subsidize Airbus exports? Why does China subsidize the exports of a whole variety of goods and services? Why does Brazil subsidize the exports of ethanol? Well, we'll come back to some of the political issues that are involved, but you raise an interesting question. Now remember that the terms, just as we talked about growth earlier, we've got domestic effects and we've got terms of trade effects, which are from the international side. The international side can actually be quite small relative to what's taking place domestically. But what typically happens here is notice that both tariffs and export subsidies are programs that protect producers. Right? A tariff protects us from import competition, where an export subsidy gives us an extra leg up in the export market. So they're beneficial for businesses. Now, typically what we'll find, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a couple of weeks, typically what we find is that tariffs are imposed at the request of the domestic import competing industry. Right? So the U.S. furniture industry or the U.S. textile industry says, wait a minute, we're getting flooded by all these Chinese furniture and clothing. We can't compete. We need some protection. We need our government to help us here. One way to do that is to come in with a tariff on very specific items. So that will provide some protection for the domestic import competing industry. You also get the other side of the argument. You get industries that are strong international competitors saying, look, we can increase our output and therefore our employment even more if you provide us with a subsidy to produce additional exports or to generate additional exports. So it's almost always comes down to protecting jobs, creating more jobs. And again, we'll look at some of the other distortions that take place. Then we'll be able to come back more fully and talk about, do the domestic effects offset the international effects or vice versa? They aren't. So the last time I checked, no, you're absolutely right. Export subsidies are not permitted under the WTO. And last time I looked, the WTO had no police force, had no army. So we'll talk about what the WTO does when a country does use export subsidies and refuses to remove them. So we'll talk about some of those, what we call trade policy tools a little bit later. But good question. Oh, it definitely changes. Increase. So we're talking about an export subsidy? Okay, so again, if we started with this relative price, right? So the export subsidy generally says, what is the world price of cloth, right? Just for simplicity's sake, let's suppose the price of wine doesn't change here. So any changes in relative prices are also changes in the price of cloth. Okay? Just to make it hopefully a little simpler. So when we find out, so P sub C then is what the price that, before the subsidy, is the price that's both internally and externally. right? So we got same price both domestically and internationally. Now Portugal comes in and says, okay, I'll give you a 20% export subsidy. Now we have a difference. This is our external price, and the internal price is going to be 20% higher. Now what happens? We end up with English producers and consumers not changing their behavior because the price hasn't changed yet. The external price hasn't changed. But domestically, producers now want to produce more, right? Price has gone up. Now remember, the price, when I give you the export subsidy, the firm says, let's take a price of $10. I can sell it for $12 if I sell it in Canada. I sell it for $10 if I get it in the United States. What do? Ship it all to Canada, right? Because I get 20% more. So that's going to raise the domestic price by 20% as well. So for domestic producers, whether they're selling internationally in the export market or domestically, the prices are going to still end up being the same. But when they sell more into Canada, or in England in this case for cloth, what happens? The relative supply comes out. But consumers aren't going to buy the same amount of cloth if the price goes up by 20%. Relative demand falls to the left. So the price that Canadians or English will pay for cloth actually falls. Now the 20%, since we generally look at international prices to figure out what the premium is, the 20% would be paid on top of this lower international price. Now, how much will that price fall? Depends upon whether it's a large country or a small country. If the U.S. does it, in a good in which we are a major exporter, we're going to get a big decline in prices. If Peru does it, it's unlikely to have much of an effect at all. Does that answer your question? Oh, you got a different question? Oh, okay. Okay. How that changes the production? Okay, so remember when the relative, if you thought about a country's production possibilities curve, so another way of looking at this, if you want to think of it, production possibility ISO value lines, this is where we started. Right? This is the ISO value line that we started with before the imposition of the export subsidy. Now, once we put the export subsidy on, the relative price of cloth rises. So what happens to the ISO value line domestically? It gets steeper. So now the tangency will be at a point where we'll produce more cloth and less wine. So you've got a production change inside the country. And that's what causes this relative supply curve to shift out. English production hasn't changed at all. They're still faced with these external prices. But internally, inside Portugal, we get changes here because we have changed the internal prices.
So other of the world regions, the production of England was changed, right? So how do you show this?
Well, the shift in the, so let's start right here. So at this, remember, these are external prices. When Portugal gives us the 20 or imposes the 20% export subsidy, at that relative price, relative supply in the world now increases straight out, right? Even if relative demand doesn't change, notice that at this relative price, the quantity supplied in the world is greater than the quantity demanded. So the relative price has to fall. As the relative price of cloth falls, England will want to produce less cloth and more wine. So we would just move down along that relative supply curve, either to here, if relative demand hasn't changed, or down to here. So notice as England responds, by the way, Portugal will respond too to this change in relative supply. As the relative price of cloth goes down, the relative quantity of cloth being produced will also fall. So notice that the reason we get shifts is because of the subsidy. The reason that we get these subsequent changes here is because the price has changed. Whenever you change price, you're moving, or change the relative price, you'll be moving along the curves. So, yes?
So the only difference between the domestic market and the international market, the curves are moving in the same direction, it's just a difference of magnitude, depending on just the extent of the shifts, it's just a difference of magnitude.
You mean the relative demand and supply curves?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're moving in the same direction, domestic or international, it's just to a different degree.
Yes. Yeah. These shifts are coming about because of the effects in Portugal, only because of the effects in Portugal, not because of any effects that are taking place in England. So it's not degrees of magnitude. The magnitude of the shift is what's happening in Portugal. Okay, so again, we've already seen all of these, and we've seen these. And again, as we saw with the tariff, the actual effect will be dependent upon how big the country is in terms of the international trade of that good, or how small it is. Now, one of the things, the question was brought up earlier, well, why would we do these kinds of things? And clearly what we see is both tariffs and export subsidies support domestic producers. So from that perspective, they're usually seen as very similar types of trade protection. But we've seen in terms of the terms of trade, they have exactly the opposite effect. So tariffs can increase a country's economic welfare. Depends on whether it's large or small. But export subsidies will always reduce Portugal's welfare. Yes? No, terms of trade, from the terms of trade, right? So remember, the effect of one country on another through here, in terms of economic welfare, is based on the terms of trade. Okay, I think we'll stop here because you don't need this for your problem set. So we'll stop here since we're running out of time. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.